Hello and welcome to A Queer Presence. I'm your host, Phoebe Singletary, and today I'm joined by Lecture Leader Lauren Younker, she, her.
Hello, for this episode we'll be talking about issues in the discipline of literature and specifically examples of how instructors depict queer characters in their classes. Today I'll be discussing how queer characters have been taught to me as an English literature student. As a bisexual woman, I am very critical of how my professors describe LGBTQ plus characters and how they teach them in relation to the piece of literature at hand. Because literature is part of the arts and humanities field, there are many professors who have done well to include texts written by LGBTQ plus authors and do their best to teach the importance of these voices. However, not all professors are like this, and I have had relatively negative experiences with those instructors who do not understand the importance of teaching queer literary characters. To start with a positive, I once took a literature class titled Contemporary American Women's Fiction. The professor for this class did a good job of creating her reading list with a variety of female authors. Women of color, queer women, and low-income women were all on our reading list. However, it's important to note that all of these women were cisgender. Focusing on the stories with queer women, I thought the professor did a good job with not just including their work in our class reading, but also discussing their sexuality as important character attributes. We read 3 fictional pieces from lesbian women, all written with heavy influence from the women's experiences. What I found important in the way the professors taught the literature was how she approached these characters' sexuality. The fact that they were lesbians was not glorified in any of the lectures, but it was not brushed over. Additionally, my professor addressed problematic parts of the text as well. For example, drawing attention to issues of consent one character lacked that may be brushed over because she was involved with another woman. On the negative side of how queer characters have been portrayed, I've seen professors essentially fetishize queer characters in the text. In situations like this, sexuality and gender identity has been taught more as uncommon and exotic. For me, this gives off the impression that these professors don't legitimize these queer characters. To these professors, the characters are here to make the literature more alternative or more shocking, not to actually just exist as queer characters. I think this is especially true with LGBTQ plus characters who are young. Professors may attribute their sexuality to confusion, or, even worse, use it as a metaphor for uncertainty and disillusionment in the text. What I'd like to see in the classroom is professors including many more LGBTQ plus authors in their reading list, and not just for classes that have a focus on queer authors, women, or other marginalized groups of people. I want to see core classes like American Literature 1 and 2 introduce queer writers into the canon. In addition, I'd like to see professors search for texts where the author is queer and brings that element into their work, but the text isn't limited to only the aspects of their sexuality. Queer characters should be represented living very human lives in every way possible, or should be able to fit into any stereotypical character role. Give me a bi-female lead in the next big murder mystery novel, and then discuss why her sexuality is important, but not the only attribute that's interesting. Thank you for listening to my take on the teaching of queer characters in literature classes. These are based off of my experiences, and it's important to remember that not all people have the same experiences and opinions. For anyone interested, the 3 books I mentioned earlier, written by the lesbian authors, were Ruby Fruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown, Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison, and Phone Home by Alison Bechdel. And a warning, these all have a variation of violent scenes in the text. Thank you.
As part of our show, we like to do a Q&A session with our lecture leaders. So, first question, and this is going to be for everyone from here on out, how does your identity intersect with this topic?
My identity intersects with this topic because I want to see representation in literature. I think it's important that to get away from othering queer characters and obviously queer people, we need representation in any form of art. So representation in literature is important.
Okay. And then speaking of that representation, you mentioned that there's need, even within marginalized groups, to include diverse characters and authors, such as the importance of including cis women and trans women in a women's group. So can you elaborate a little more on why that's important?
Right, so I think that goes along with the same kind of mindset that to include trans women into a women's literature class, a women's fiction class, it broadens, the canon broadens the voices of who the writers are, and it broadens how we see the characters.
Okay. Finally, last question. In addition to the literature you mentioned in your lecture, is there any other literature that you would also recommend that people look into if they're looking for examples of representation in authors or characters?
So I have this graphic novel titled Heartbeats, the Azat Project, written by the Azat Collective, and it's written by all Southeast Asian women. Not every story has a queer author, but there are queer stories within the book. It's just a great collection of young women describing how their identities intersect and what that means to them. And I recommend it. I read it recently, and the illustrations are pretty cute too.
All right, thank you very much. Coming up next on A Queer Presence in Literature, we'll be discussing the dangers of only treating straight white male authors as classics. Feel free to message us with any questions you have. Spam and hate mail, as always, will be ignored. Until next time, with love and kindness, I'm Phoebe Singletary.
I'm Lauren Younker.
And this has been A Queer Presence.